We began last night with Dr. Kinnear talking to us about how it is that Christians today really do have an obligation to the moral law. And then we looked at the first use of the law, as theologians have characterized that last evening with Professor York. And now this morning we come to the second use of the law. The law restrains evil. And Dr. Rick Gamble will be making this presentation. Dr. Gamble is the professor of systematic theology at RPTS. He's been here since 2005, and we look forward to sitting under his teaching this morning. So Rick, come and bring the word to us.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Last night we heard about the first use of the law, and that was visually very challenging to think about black pearls being placed on the neck of the unbeliever. In a few minutes we'll hear about the third use of the law. And the third use of the law is the delight for the Christian. It's our meditation all the day. Well, sandwiched in between is the second use of the law. And sometimes, well, the second use is more like the ugly stepsister. But what I hope to do is make it more like the Oreo cookie. You've got great chocolate on the outside, but inside is the sweet pig fat and sugar, which is a major food group. So that's with that introduction, Okay, am I pushing the wrong one? Whoops, Aaron, I'm sorry, what did I do wrong? I'm sorry, which one do I push?
Just the right arrow.
The right arrow.
Yep.
Thank you. This is the outline that you have printed out before you. I'll be following this outline. We had the snappy introduction that you just heard. Now let's go to the definition of the second use of the law and the standards. At Westminster Confession of Faith, Confession of Faith, chapter 19, the topic was God's law. In chapter 19:1, the divines introduced the law given to Adam in the garden as a covenant of works. The law as a covenant of works with Adam in the garden. And the divines teach that the covenant of works is binding upon all of Adam's posterity. So the Adamic law as a covenant of works binding his posterity has roots theologically back to the 16th century in Scottish theology. Well, after this fall in 1902, God gave, and notice if you have the Westminster Confession in front of you, which you don't, but notice that they refer to this law, and it seems that the reference is in fact to the Adamic law. This law is given as a perfect rule of righteousness called the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments in the mind of the divines was connected to what was given to Adam. The Ten Commandments were divided into twofold duties on the one hand toward God and the one hand toward man. And these Ten Commandments are categorized by the divines as the moral law. Now, this law is still the rule of God's judgment over men, and that's called the first use of the law. And Pastor York made that very clear to us last night. At 1903, besides the moral law, there was another law that the divines categorized by the word ceremonial. There was a ceremonial law given by God to what they call the church underage. That law had typical ordinances that were types, typical ordinances in worship that prefigured Christ, as well as some instructions and moral duties. Now, the divines concluded in that section, chapter 19, that all which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. All which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. The fourth section of the chapter is short, and let me simply read it to you. The fourth section. It's just one sentence. Well, one sentence in the Westminster Confession. To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. We'll be talking about that some more as we continue. In the fifth section of chapter 19, the divines taught that the moral law binds Christians and non-Christians to obedience. The moral law binds both believers and unbelievers to obedience. And their wording is very clear and actually rather strong. The moral law, quoting them, doth forever bind all to the obedience thereof. The divine stressed that Christ's redemptive work did not dissolve the obligation, but rather strengthened it. On that note, the first presentation concerning the law itself mentioned that obeying the moral law makes, do you remember what Jack said, makes us more human. I thought that was particularly well said. When we walk in accordance with the moral law, it's not particularly Christian, it's particularly human. And I think that's what the divines are saying in this fifth section, that all men and women are obligated to follow that law. And in the sixth and final section of the confession, they outlined in what fashion God's law is the rule of life. And Pastor Tweedale will be talking about the third use of the law, where it's identified in the sixth section. So here they emphasize that the moral law is useful because it keeps us humble. It also discourages us from sin and promises encouragement to us in obedience. Thus, in this 19th chapter, defining the law, there's an overall harmony and progression as they develop their teaching. Furthermore, B in your outline, the definition of the law in the Westminster Larger Catechism. The definition in the Westminster Larger Catechism, these are in questions 92 through 97. In the Larger Catechism, what was given to Adam in the garden is specifically called the moral law. The moral law. That's usually a term for the Ten Commandments, but the divines in the Larger Catechism didn't make a mistake, did they? But they called it the moral law. We'll see some of the implications. Question 93 is a beautiful summary of the moral law. I don't think I have. Nope. Yeah. Beautiful summary of the moral law. Question 94 introduced a complex notion. There they say that while no one can obtain righteousness and life by the moral law, nevertheless, they say, using the words of the Larger Catechism, there is great use thereof for both the elect and the reprobate. And I think that this question and answer is a parallel to chapter 19, section 6. Now, in question and answer 95, the theme continues, and there we are told that the moral law convinces men of their sin, again, Pastor York's first use of the law, but also includes the notion that we are to, quoting from the Larger Catechism, walk accordingly. Yet question and answer 96 clearly elaborates the first use as it condemns the unregenerate. Moving then to question and answer 97, there the divines remind us that we are not under the law as a covenant of works, repeating chapter 19, section 6, but they are to be thankful to Christ for his fulfilling of that law, and that they should take great care to conform themselves to it. Now, the elaboration in the Larger Catechism, which in fact seems to be more complex than and extends beyond chapter 19, was specifically crafted after the confession to deal with a contemporary problem that we'll investigate in just a few minutes, the problem of antinomianism. The problem of antinomianism. So in summary, see in your outline, in summary, the divines set before us three uses of the law. Three uses of the law. First, the law is effective particularly before our conversion. That's sometimes called the pedagogical use. It's the law as a standard for righteousness that crushes us and condemns us. The second use of the law, this morning's topic, is the law as a restraint of sin. And the third use is the law as guiding the righteous in their walk. So understanding the three uses of the law, let's turn now to the importance of these three definitions, the importance of these three definitions. Before I go to D, the importance of definition, I need to make an advertisement. I'm older than some of you, and some of you really enjoy reading blogs. Most of you are younger than me who read the blogs, but reading blogs is helpful even for those of us who are sometimes a little older, and I want to go to a blog as a source for the importance of definition. So you see on the screen a quotation from a blog, and I have this quotation not because it's a brilliant quotation, but because it's written by, it's the blog of a former colleague at a seminary where I taught immediately before coming here. And you'll see in brackets the word "the pastor," and the pastor is a member of the same denomination, the same southern denomination, and the pastor of a very large megachurch that happens to be in Florida. So going to blogs can be useful. Notice what the seminary professor says in his blog. So what's going on here? I wonder if he's talking about a discussion within the PCA concerning the use of the law. I wonder if the real missing distinction here is not the distinction between law and gospel, but the distinction between the second use and the third use of the law. The clear focus of the pastor's response, his name's out good, the pastor's response article was on the second use of God's moral law, namely that the law functions to expose our sinfulness, reveal our failure, and to drive us to Christ. Then the blog added, put differently, the law is not just something that condemns, second use, but it is also for the believer a necessary guide to holiness, third use. He concluded, if one thinks mainly in second use categories, then the article's call to obedience, again, it doesn't say the article has the pastor's name, might sound like a call to legalism. Now, legalism will be the last topic that we'll be speaking about this morning. Now, while I have this on the screen because the wording is complex and it would be impossible to communicate it just verbally, notice the professor's definition of the second use of the law in this blog. He says it exposes our sinfulness and reveals our failure. Clearly, my distinguished colleague didn't hear Pastor York's lecture last night. In Pastor York's outstanding presentation, he told us that the black pearls is the first use of the law. So the learned colleague is not speaking of the second use of the law, but in fact, the first and the third. So if a professor currently teaching at a major seminary can be confused in his blog, it's important for us to understand the first, the second, and the third use of the law and their interaction. So with that in mind, let's go to Roman numeral 2, the function of the second use of the law in the Westminster Standards, the function. So we defined the law, but now we need to see how it works. What is the function of the law? Now, by the way, you're staying awake. I'm getting more and more practical. So, but I'm staying with the Westminster Confession. This is a very practical document. The context of the Westminster Divines, the issues that they faced, the issues that they faced in their time involved three different controversial topics, and we'll need to understand all three of them. The first is the papacy. The second is what we call Erastianism, and the third is antinomianism. So relative to the second use of the law, we've got the problems of the papacy. And the teaching of the Roman Church from the time of the crowning of the emperor in 800 AD until today is that the Pope in Rome is the supreme spiritual head of the church and also the supreme political head of the earth. So we can't forget the teaching of 1,000 years of the Roman Catholic Church. He's not simply our Papa spiritually, he is our political Papa as well. He has the right to depose monarchs. He has the right to say the monarch is no longer the monarch. So he's not simply the head of the church, but he is the civil leader of the whole earth. Now, please ask questions about that if I haven't been clear. Let's go to the second one, which is actually more important for the divines, I think, and more difficult for us to understand, the problem of what's called Erastianism. Now, if this were a seminary classroom, I'd ask the real question, but it's not a seminary classroom, so don't answer. Are the Westminster Standards Erastian? And I'll give you the option. You can vote either yes or no, and you've got a 50% chance. If you vote no, you're wrong. So the Westminster divines are Erastian depending on how we define the word Erastian. So we're going to define the word Erastianism rather carefully. Erastianism in terms of, if you maybe don't, I know it's a smart room, don't look on your computers at Wikipedia, but Wikipedia would say Erastianism is when the state is over the church, and that would be correct. But in what ways is the state over the church? So do we want to say that the Westminster divines saw the state over the church? That would make us uncomfortable, but maybe that's right. Now, Erastianism, however, in the time of the divines in the 17th century, we have to step back in time and remember the context. Dr. Kinnear said, context is always key. He was talking about biblical text. Context is key to understanding the Westminster documents. They haven't dropped out of the 21st century and suddenly appeared in Pittsburgh. They are written in a time when the Parliament of England calls these ministers together to create something, and just about every day they're getting love letters from Parliament reminding them, you are here at our pleasure, and you can't do this, you can't do that, without asking us. And by the way, we're paying you to be here. So they were controlling the divines. That's inherently Erastian. So you've got mild Erastianism. For example, if you were to live in Switzerland and work in the Swiss Reformed Church today, you would be paid on the same level as a captain or a major in the Swiss Army. In other words, you are employed by the state. That's Erastianism. Now, is there Erastianism in Scotland even till today? Well, if the Queen Elizabeth comes to Scotland, and go ahead, you can look on Wikipedia under the topic of precedence in the order of Scotland, you'll see that when Queen Elizabeth visits Edinburgh and there's a procession before all the dukes and the earls and all the royal, high and mighty, who follows the Queen? It is the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, who is recognized in precedence as higher than the nobility of Scotland. So is there Erastianism in present-day Scotland, in the Church of Scotland? We have to say indubitably. So is Erastianism good or bad? That's the issue. And the issue is, in what way were the divines fighting against Erastianism? Erastianism wins. We're going to see that the divines will say that the civil magistrate can call a synod. Now, that would seem rather peculiar to get a letter from the President of the United States calling us to Geneva College next June or something. Not many of us would consider that a legitimate synodical call. But that is the position that the divines will take, as we'll see in just a minute. So Erastianism wins. The issue that I want us to focus on this morning is this. The divines, particularly a guy named Gillespie and a man named Rutherford, Gillespie and Rutherford, were engaged in tremendous pamphlet battle with a former Presbyterian minister whose name was Coleman. And Coleman was an Erastian. And Coleman argues in many pamphlets this way, that all magistrates have an office given to them from Christ. All magistrates are, quoting Coleman, under Christ and for Christ. All magistrates everywhere at all times. So the question is, by definition, is the mayor of Pittsburgh, does he hold a church office? The Erastian position held by Coleman is yes. The fact that he is the mayor of Pittsburgh means that he has a church office like an elder. He has a legitimate office of the church. Now, all of us would scratch our heads and say, that's nuts. And it is. And that's what Gillespie and Rutherford are fighting against. So, does Jesus set up civil magistrates as officers in the church? Will be a topic, an Erastian topic, that we'll come back to in just a minute. And then the third context is that of the antinomians. The antinomians. And the antinomians, again, didn't hear last night's lecture. They didn't understand what Jack Kinnear carefully brought out before us. That Christ came, and all those passages that say he has abolished the law does not mean that he has abolished the moral law. But the antinomians taught that we are freed from the moral law itself. Now, the antinomians by this time in England were not wild people like they were in Germany in the 16th century, like in Munster. They were law-abiding, but the important point is that there is a new law, the antinomians argue, a new law, simply the law of Christ, or the love of Christ. That's the nature of the Christian life. So the third use has gone from the antinomians. Once again, they'll play an important role, and we'll take perhaps a look at them a little bit later. Let's move on to chapter 20 in the Westminster Confession of Faith. In chapters 20 through 23, this is B in your lecture outline, chapters 20 through 23, the divines elaborate the function of the law in the life of the believer. And in chapter 20, we have the title of Christian Liberty and Liberty of Conscience. So in chapter 20, section 1, the moral law is there presented to us, and it is described, no matter what Jack said last night, as a curse. It's described as a curse. So how can that be? Well, we're set free from the yoke of the ceremonial law as a covenant of works that binds us and brings us to death. Then in the next section, the divines tell us that where there is a doctrine or a commandment of man touching faith and worship that is contrary to the Word of God or beside it, we have no obligation to obey or believe those commands. And in the third section of chapter 20, we have freedom from the law, but not freedom to pursue sin. Now in section 4, chapter 20, section 4 of the Westminster Confession, we're told that Christian liberty cannot oppose lawful civil or ecclesiastical power. Let me say it again, 20.4. Christian liberty cannot oppose lawful civil or ecclesiastical power. And to resist lawfully called civil or ecclesiastical power in the name of Christian liberty is to resist what the divines call the ordinance of God. However, There are wicked people who hold false teachings and false practice. And the divines tell us that when someone has opinions or practices that are contrary to the light of nature or to the known principles of Christianity, let me see if I have that. To the light of nature, the known principles of Christianity, whether concerning faith, worship, or conversation, or, continuing to quote them, to the power of godliness, or that they have opinions that are, and here's where you have it on the PowerPoint, opinions that are, and quoting them, destructive to the external peace and order which Christ hath established in the church. Then those who hold such erroneous opinions or practices may be called into account and proceeded against by the censures of the church and by the power of the civil magistrate. They go on to also discuss engaging in war, and of course, this is an issue that was very important to the divines as they're writing the confession. Why? Because the nation is engaged in civil war at that very minute. They are opposing the civil magistrate. Now, just as an aside, for those who are interested, the testimony of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America on chapter 20.6 does not delete the part that I have there quoted, but does say the civil magistrate has no authority to pronounce ecclesiastical censures. So the current position that you read here from the Westminster Confession of Faith is in fact the current position of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. Now moving ahead to the larger catechism, question and answer 98, we've seen that the moral law is summarily comprehended in the Ten Commandments. And in the larger catechism, the divines give us rules for understanding the Ten Commandments. Once again, if we heard anything from Dr. Kinnear last night, the Ten Commandments and the moral law is something that all men and women are to obey and to follow simply because they are creatures created by a good and just God. Well, the divines want to make sure that we understand this moral law and how to walk in it. So the rules that they give answer the question, how should the moral law function in our lives? And perhaps this will be part of the third use of the law that will be brought up later. But let's take a quick look at Westminster Larger Catechism 99 and notice the rules that are to be observed. Let me summarize them. The 8 rules can be summarized this way. God's perfect law binds all men to complete obedience. That's rule 1. God's perfect law binds all men to not partial but complete obedience. Rule number 1. Including the inner man as well as the outer man. Rule 2. The Ten Commandments extend beyond the specific wording of the commandments themselves. Rules 3 through 6. That which is commanded or forbidden to ourselves, Rule 7, they say, we are bound according to our places to endeavor that it may be avoided or performed by others according to the duties of their places. So, brothers and sisters, each of us, according to this understanding, the Westminster Larger Catechism, has responsibilities as individuals, as parents, and as members of society. And they tell us in Rule 7, we are bound according to our places. We all have different places to endeavor that which is commanded or that which is prohibited be avoided or performed by others according to the duty of their places. Now, thirdly, in chapter 21 of religious worship in the Sabbath day, we see some important parts that tangentially touch the second use of the law. For example, in section 3 of chapter 21, fascinating, and certainly we could have a long discussion on it, and perhaps there'll be questions. They tell us that prayer is enjoined upon all humans, not just believers. Now, this should be a problem in terms of practical application of the second use of the law. Furthermore, in sections 7 and 8 of chapter 21 concerning the Sabbath, The divines say that this law, the Sabbath law, is, quoting them, binding all men in all ages. Binding all men in all ages. Now, this should also be a problem. They call this day the Lord's Day or the Christian Sabbath. They connect it back to the creation ordinances and argue that it is perpetually binding on all men at all time. They talk about the nature of that holy rest. Let me continue. Chapter 22, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 22, also relates to the second use of the law, specifically on the use of lawful oaths and vows. Now, the lawful oaths and vows was specifically written against a group that we call the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists already in 1529 had maintained that we can take no oaths or vows. And the Scots were a nation of oath takers. They were a people who took vows. We'll perhaps have some time to reflect on them. There was this thing called the Solemn League and Covenant. So it's appropriate for churches and nations, says the RPC in a testimony on this at 22:9, to covenant to be the Lord's and to serve him. Well, with that background, we get into the heart of the matter concerning the second use of the law, and that is chapter 23 on the civil magistrate. And let me begin by summarizing sections 1 and 2. The divines began by establishing broad principles of civil government. The civil magistrate is ordained under God, using their words, for his own glory. God has ordained government. God has ordained government. He's the supreme Lord and King of the whole human race. Everyone is responsible to him and accountable to him. Civil magistrates are given the task of ruling over the people. And most commentators say there's no hint here of government of the people by the people. That could be a problematic issue for question and answer. But the first task, according to the divines in sections 1 and 2, chapter 23, the first task is to promote the glory of the triune God. Then comes their responsibility to promote the common good. And this strikes at the very heart of the second use of the law. The second use of the law being restraining sin. So the civil magistrate has a responsibility by God, before God, to promote the glory of the triune God, which would, of course, be restraining sin. So the magistrate does what? He encourages those who are good, and he punishes evildoers. Now, how did the divines define the important words good and evil? So we all agree the moral law should be followed by all. The divines say the civil magistrate has a responsibility by God to promote the moral law. The moral law is, by definition, good. So what is good used by the Westminster divines? Well, the word good and what they understood by promoting good and punishing evil is very clear because context is king. Earlier in a confession called the Scots Confession, in the Scots Confession, let's do Scots Confession chapter 14, there they say this: God regards works as good are those according to the first and second tables of the Decalogue. Good works are those which are in accord with the first and second tables of the Decalogue. A less known confession is what we'll call the French Confession. It has a Latin title, the Gallican Confession. It was first composed by Calvin in 1557, then expanded. And there in chapter 23, we read, we believe that the ordinances we believe that the ordinances of the law came to an end at the advent of Jesus Christ, but although the ceremonies are no more in use, yet their substance and truth remain in the person of him in whom they are fulfilled. And moreover, we must seek aid from the law and the prophets for the ruling of our lives as well as for the confirmation in the promises of the gospel. So that's foundational, I think, to what the divines will say. Then later on in chapter 39, they expand by telling us that we believe that God wishes to have the world governed by laws and magistrates so that some restraint may be put upon its disordered appetites. That's the second use. That's what I'm talking about this morning. And he's established kingdoms, republics, and principalities, and all that belongs to a just government and wishes to be considered their author. So he's put the sword into the hands of the magistrates to suppress crimes against the first as well as against the second table of God's commandments. Therefore, we need to submit to them in reverence. So already in the 16th century and continued through the Scots Confession before the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Confession follows, I think, the earlier teaching of Calvin and his successors concerning the nature of the civil magistrate. But one of the big questions that we need to answer this morning is in the third section of chapter 23 concerning the civil law and the civil magistrate. And that is the statement that the divines make concerning the Old Testament civil law as not abrogated but expired. Now, let me do an advertisement. Do you remember the summary of the moral law as mentioned by both of our speakers last night? There's one word that summarizes the moral law. It's love. It's love. From now on, I'm going to ask you to exercise the moral law. So I'm going to say things that can make almost everybody mad at some point. And it's my job, what I'm doing now is simply presenting the teaching of the Westminster Confession. So get mad at them if you want, but love me, please. So what does it mean that the civil law is not abrogated but expired? We can understand it in two basic ways. Number one, we can be what's called theonomists. Theonomists. The theonomist says this expression means it's expired, but it's still there. It's expired, but it's still there. Or we can take another view, and that's the view, for example, if you're a PCA, and you read 23:3, you'll see that your confession of faith doesn't look like what the divines wrote. So you'll take this teaching concerning it and modify it. Or you can be RPCNA, and you can erase it. However we want to understand 23:3, the divines teach what we call the establishment principle, whether we like it or not. That is, that the church and the state are united. The church and the state are united. But the question that I want us to address is the specific wording of not abrogated and expired. And I've chosen an example, and I haven't run it by the person I'm going to abuse, and I hope that he will exercise the moral law concerning me. So we have this example. Perhaps some of you here are from the Board of Trustees. And President O'Neill has expired. That means he can't give the faculty any more rules because he has expired. However, the Board of Trustees could meet while he's still alive and say, although he's still alive, all of his rules are abrogated. Everything that he's established is now overturned. So if he said the chalkboard is white, it is now black. If he said don't park on the parking lot except between the yellow lines, everything that he has said is abrogated. You see the difference between Dr. O'Neill's expired? That means all of his rules are still there. He's just not giving us anymore. He's expired. But to say that his rules are abrogated means they're overturned. So is the civil law abrogated? That means everything O'Neill said, black is white, white is black, or is the law expired? I think that's perhaps the best way to cut through all the questions relative to theonomy and some of those other issues. But also in this section, they talk about the general equity of the law still continuing. Now, what is this general equity? Well, the general equity, according to some, is that all the rituals of the law are gone, but something still remains from at least case law of the Old Testament. The way I've explained it, I hope, with expired and abrogated will meet our understanding of general equity. So if President O'Neill has expired, his laws, he's not making any more laws, but the thrust of the rules that he has established should be continued by whoever succeeds the president. Again, I didn't ask him if that was okay, and I hope that I'm clear using that example to explain what's going on. Let's go to Roman numeral 3 in our lecture outline, the application of the second use of the law in the Westminster Standards. The magistrate is to uphold the moral law. The magistrate is to uphold the moral law. Now, I've already given some lectures on two-kingdom theology, and I want to ask simply one sentence, one question, because it's tangentially related, and that's this. The Westminster Divines say the magistrate is to uphold the moral law. Now, the two-kingdom position is that the state is to be based upon common morality or a natural law that is not necessarily coterminous with the moral law. Why do the divines say specifically that they are not to uphold the law of nature, but they are to uphold the moral law? So if a two-kingdom theologian can demonstrate that natural law and common morality have the same content as did the divines concerning the Ten Commandments. Remember the larger catechism? All it means. So only if there is a continuity between natural law and the divine's understanding of the Ten Commandments can I think that their teaching squares with the Westminster Confession. So, okay, maybe a cheap shot, but that's what I get to do because I'm standing here. One more important clarification then concerning the magistrate upholding the moral law. We ask ourselves this question, the theological question, it's one word, how's comes? Now we do that as we read the scriptures. We want to ask the divines, why should the magistrate uphold the moral law? And the answer in terms of theological categories is because of God's essential kingship. If you're taking notes, write this down, please. Because of essential kingship. Remember all the stuff that Jack said last night. God is the creator. Mom and dad, you're the parents of the children. You have rights over your children. God is the creator. God is good. God gives us his law. His law is an expression of his very being. It's not something that is tangential to his being. Therefore, to walk in his law is to walk in his image. What Jack said for an hour last night was an elaboration of the essential kingship of God over all the earth. So the magistrate enforces the moral law because God is the essential king. He's the essential king. But there is a second way of understanding God's kingship that goes beyond his essential kingship, called his mediatorial kingship. His mediatorial kingship. And the mediatorial kingship applies particularly to the second person of the Trinity, to Jesus Christ, the God-man, who left the realms of glory, lived under the law, suffered the curse of the law, was crucified, and is now resurrected, seated in glory. And the scriptures say over and over that he has been given a name that is higher than any other name, and that at his name every knee should bow and every tongue confess that he is Kurios, that he is the Lord of all things. So the New Testament teaches a yet higher kingship called Christ's mediatorial kingship and Christ's mediatorial power. And the question is, does the civil magistrate's responsibility to enforce the moral law in any sense relate to the mediatorial kingship as well as the essential kingship? And the answer is it relates to the mediatorial kingship as well, because the Westminster Divines teach clearly that Christ's mediatorial power is not restricted simply to believers and the church, but that the civil rulers are also subject to the Messiah and bound to recognize his revealed will and to promote the interests of the kingdom. nations and associations of men in their corporate capacity are subject to the law and the authority of Jesus Christ. This was the divine's understanding of the duties of the civil magistrate. Look again, in summary, at section 2, 23.2. 23.2 says, the magistrates ought especially to maintain piety. Magistrates ought to maintain piety. How does that relate to essential kingship? Well, it does, but clearly this relates to mediatorial kingship. And by the way, that's not modified in the RPCNA testimony. Furthermore, the Westminster Confession argued that the magistrate has both the authority and the duty to preserve peace within the church. Now, we may choose to reject that, but that's the clear teaching. The magistrate has the authority and the duty to preserve peace in the church. Why? That the truth of God be kept pure and entire. Now, the magistrate has a responsibility to make sure that the truth, that which is preached from the pulpit, is both pure and entire. So this is a pretty radical document. Okay, so 23.2. Now, oops, I should have done that. Sorry, I got too excited. Let's move on to B. We need to understand something that is foreign to us as Americans, at least, the notion that civil government is a moral being. There's an inherent presupposition in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Remember that context is key. Context is key. I see that my time's going quickly, but I'll go as quickly as I can. Context is key, and the issue of the civil government being a moral being flows out of the historical context. So I think I'm going to put my notes aside and just use the outline in the minutes that are remaining. First of all, in the 16th century particularly, in terms of political theory, the social contract was being established both inside the church and outside the church, particularly with political legal theorists. The social contract, very simply, is what we see in the American Constitution, we the people. The social contract can be seen both negatively and positively. Rutherford, in Lex Rex and his other writings, is very much a proponent of the social contract. That is, that there must be a coordination between the civil magistrate and the people. If, for example, the civil magistrate it becomes a tyrant, if the civil magistrate decrees that which is wicked, then we, the people, are in a contractual relationship with that monarch or that civil government in terms of a mutual responsibility. Now, the historical background, particularly to the Scottish commissioners concerning the issue of civil government as moral being, is very clear and very easy to understand when we analyze Scottish political history. Beginning in the 700s, as Scotland became a nation, it was a nation modeled on Irish Celtic tradition, where you have a number of kings who rule together and they choose a high king from among the kings. So if you've got 5 equally strong men who need to work together, you can elect a president of the 5, and we called him the High King. That's Scottish political history beginning in the 700s. It continued through Scottish history, and for those of you who have Mac before your name, it's not simply what the people, the Aboriginal people up in the Highlands were doing, running around in their clans. That was my levity today. It's not just that the clan structure was relegated to the Highlands. In fact, when we study Scottish political history, the clan structure was the structure of the monarchy itself. So there is no analogy in Scotland to English king and parliament. So what happened in 1066 in England does not have a Scottish analogy. No differences between Scotland and England were particularly clear, and the differences became quite clear in the 14th century in a conflict between Bruce and his family and Balliol and his family. But the differences became even more clear in the 1430s when a Scottish king by the name of James I returned from long captivity in England, and he realized that it was a pretty good deal to be king in England, and he wanted things to change in Scotland. Oh, but you know the Scots, they love to change, right? Okay, that's the real levity. There will be a reason for this, my blabbing. The year is 1556. It is at the time of the Reformation. The Parliament of Scotland makes clear to the monarch of Scotland in these words. The title, says the Parliament to the king, the title, king or the queen, King of Scotland is, in the minutes of Parliament, the personal high king of Scotland, not the territorial king of Scotland. In the Scottish Parliament made clear, 1556, the model for rule in Scotland is not England, it is what we've been having for the last almost 1,000 years in terms of Scottish history. That is, there was no House of Commons in Scotland until way after the Reformation. There's no House of Scotland. Now, in 1740s, things change in Scotland because of the Jacobite Rebellion. But the current legal position in Scotland, remember next month, they're voting on a referendum to leave. There's been an explosion of legal history going on concerning Scotland. And the present situation is clear that from the 700s, Scottish historians have said that the notion of the king in Scotland and the notion of lordship in Scotland is the notion of the clan. That is, the earl or the baron is seen as the father of the family. So all the Waverley novels and all the things that you maybe read with Sir Walter Scott, where the clan leader is, he invites his clan to eat at his table, they're of the same blood. This is the operative notion. Now, why is this so important to me? Whoops, I forgot it again. Okay. Questions, you can please ask questions about that. All right, whoops, all right. The reason why this is so important to me is because there is a mistaken notion concerning the nature of the Scottish divines' understanding of civil government that was presented from this same podium at the Westminster Conference a few years ago by a distinguished colleague. That paper was then published in a publication to honor my predecessor. And in that paper, the paper outlined, the paper outlined that Christ rules over the nations, and his point was that Rutherford believed that Christ ruled over the nations only as essential king, not as mediatorial king. And the title of his paper is From Popery to Presupposition, or from, Rutherford says it's the height of popery to do X, and this mistaken colleague says that's not the Covenanter position. The Covenanter position is what Rutherford called the papal position. And my point is this. Rutherford and the Scottish divines saw the king as a moral being who represented his nation. And as the divines teach that fathers in families are to lead their families in worship, so the king as a moral being, or the principality, the civil government, the parliament, as a moral being, has a responsibility under Jesus Christ to lead his family, his nation, in proper worship and proper government. Well, there it is. Well, what my colleague said, that thus what was once derided as popery has become a defining and distinctive principle of contemporary Covenanters. I feel obligated to say that this fellow has failed to understand Scottish history. He has failed to understand the context of the Westminster Confession, and he's done a disservice in publishing that article. I've gone through two, and my time is up. So at this point, I think Dr. O'Neill, I should simply stop.
I hate to stop you at this point.